So let me ask you a question this morning, church. Haven't even started yet. How many of you struggle with doubt when it comes to God? Anybody? Yeah. I mean, if we're honest about it, almost all of us have been there. Probably every single one of us has had moments in our lives of doubt. Doubt that God could, doubt that God cared, maybe even doubt that God was even there. We've all had those moments, right? And we struggle with doubt. Why? Why do we have doubt in our lives? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Sometimes I think we struggle with doubt when what we expect to happen doesn't happen. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Sometimes I think we struggle with doubt when God works in a way that we can't understand or see in a particular moment in our life, right? That happens all the time, doesn't it? Sometimes doubt creeps up when we're facing personal pain or failure in our lives. I know there's somebody in this room who knows what I'm talking about, right? Doubt creeps in on all kinds of places. You've been there and you've done that. And when we can't see evidence that points to something being true, when we can't see it with our own two eyes, we have trouble believing that it's true, right? Now, the problem with doubt is that it starts out as a seed planted in your mind and in your heart by the enemy. But guess what happens? All of a sudden, if we let it grow and if we let it fester, it starts to turn into full-on disbelief. And when you get there, it could be really destructive in your life. Amen? A couple of weeks ago, knowing that we were going to be wrestling with this passage and this topic, I asked a question on Facebook, hoping for your feedback, and I asked this very simple question. The question was, when have you doubted God? And there was a ton of stuff that came back, of course, because everybody has a moment they can remember. But there was one particular story that I wanted to share with you today, and ironically, it comes from a guy named Tom, right? My cousin, actually, Thomas, and he gave me permission to share this, and so I want you to listen to the email he sent me that very same day. He said, I honestly don't really know where to begin, and so I'm going to begin by telling you that at the age of 12, I attended First Baptist Church and eventually was molested by a parishioner. I tell you this only because it's caused me to do a few things in my life that I probably wouldn't have done if that hadn't happened. This event has affected my life over the last 34 years in several ways. I've tried going to church a few times over the last few years, but I always stop going because I no longer feel comfortable sitting in a church. And I figured out why over the last few months. I figured that I was harboring some resentment, possibly even some hatred toward God for allowing that event to happen to me, and it scares me. I even wrestle often with bouts of doubt that there is such a thing as God at all, because if there was, why would He let such a terrible thing happen? From that moment till now, if I'm honest, I basically kicked any idea of God I had to the curb because He let me down. I also don't know how to trust or even get close to people because I'm always afraid that they're going to hurt me. This includes my family. I'm a very guarded person who doesn't know how to let things go and truly forgive people who I feel have wronged me. I've struggled with pornography since not long after I was molested. In fact, for several years, I watched pornography every single day, sometimes more than once a day. I've tried to convince myself that it was wrong, that God doesn't approve, but I'm so angry with Him sometimes that I convince myself that He doesn't care what I do, even if He's there at all. But the truth is, I struggle with terrible guilt and shame about it. I've tried to stop on my own, but I've struggled every time. I've tried to ask God to forgive me, but I feel guilt about that because I don't really even want to stop. And as usual, it feels like He's nowhere to be found. I've tried to forgive myself, but that's really of no use either. I know this is pretty graphic, he says, but I was hoping that by sharing it with somebody, it would help me to feel released from the guilt and the shame and maybe begin to move my life in the right direction. Thanks for listening. Now, for the sake of time and length, I cut out some of Tom's story, but I think you get the gist. Tom's struggling with a whole bunch of stuff, but he's struggling in particular with doubt. Big time, right? And most of us get it, right? I mean, as I read this, as you heard it this morning, many of us probably at least entertain the question, why, God? Why in the world did this happen? We might even be asking the question, why would you let this happen? what I've learned about that why question is that it doesn't take us long to start asking other questions, right? It's not a huge leap from why God to where's God, right? It's easy to doubt that God is nearby when we see things that don't make any sense to us or that don't align with the way that we think life ought to go. And it's easy to wonder where God is when trials and pain come that we cannot explain. Amen? That's where my cousin Tom is right now as he wrestles with his life and his past. And it's where our friend Thomas was in the story that Kathy read just a couple of minutes ago, right? Thomas wasn't there when Jesus showed up to reconnect with his other friends. I'm not sure where he went. The Bible's really clear that they were afraid, and so they had locked themselves up because they were afraid what the Jews were going to do to them. And so they had kind of contained themselves, but for some reason, Thomas wasn't there. Now, you can take that out, and you can think through it, and you can come to lots of reasons about why maybe, right? Like maybe Thomas needed a little bit of space because it was pretty crammed quarters, right? And so maybe Thomas needed a few moments to get away, or maybe he drew the short straw and had to go get supplies for the rest of the group. I don't know why he wasn't there, but the story says that Thomas wasn't home when Jesus showed up, but when he got back from wherever it was that he went, he was hearing some stuff that seemed pretty crazy to him, right? He had already resolved in his mind that things were going to change. Jesus was gone. There was nothing he could do about that. There was nothing he was going to try to do about that except move on, and that's what he was trying to do. And when his friends started telling him crazy stuff like Jesus came and visited them, Thomas did what most of us and most of them would have done. He had some doubt, right? In fact, he was sure that they all had lost their minds. There was no way Thomas was going to believe any of that craziness unless he could stick his hand on Jesus' wounds all by himself and prove it to himself. Now, we get that, don't we? I mean, every single one of us, and let's just be honest right now, every single one of us, we hear that and we go, man, I get it. I get why Thomas was there because that's exactly where I'd be, right? I don't have any question that that'd be the question I'd be asking too. You know what? If Jesus was here, where is he now? Right? Prove it to me. Give me a way to see it. Right? We want some good reason to believe that God's got us and that God has got this when we are in the midst of the storms of our lives. Amen? That's right. And when we can't see it, when we're in the throes of it, when it seems impossible, we catch ourselves beginning to think that it probably is impossible. Amen? So, what do we do about that? What is it that we do when we are overcome with doubt in our lives? When doubt is threatening to destroy us and keep us from living the life that God designed for us to live, what are we supposed to do about it? I want to take us back to the story that Kathy read a few minutes ago, and I want to notice a few things about it. Number one, everybody, somebody say everybody. Everybody wrestles with doubt. Everybody wrestles with doubt. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a great big duh, right? Thanks, Pastor, for filling us in. Because we already knew. We all wrestle with doubt, right? And I know that, but here's the reality. I believe that we get ourselves stuck in doubt because we aren't willing to admit that we have it. Now, we keep it down deep inside of us, and we don't tell anybody, but that's the reality. When somebody comes to us, we try to put a pretty face on it. We try to look good in the middle of it, but the reality is that we're struggling just like Thomas was with some doubt. But notice something here. Thomas gets a pretty bad rap to this day about having some doubt, but the truth is Thomas wasn't the only one who had some doubt. Thomas was the only one bold enough to say it out loud, right? He was the only one to speak up about it, right? See, before Jesus showed up to the others while Thomas was gone, they had some doubt too, didn't they? They had doubt that Jesus was alive. They had doubt that Jesus had gotten up out of the grave. They had some doubt that Jesus could come back and that he would. They had the same doubts that Thomas had. Every single one of them. They just weren't talking about it. But when Thomas got home and his friends told him what they had seen, Thomas didn't hesitate to announce to them that he didn't believe it. There was no way he could believe it. How could he? How could we? Right? We know what he's talking about. Everybody wrestles with doubt. We all have it. The people who knew him best didn't believe that Jesus was coming back when he told them over and over and over again that he was. Right? I think it's important that we all hear that. that everybody wrestles with doubt, because I don't want you to leave here thinking that you're a horrible person because you've had doubt in your life. Amen? You are not alone. Turn to your neighbor and say, you're not alone. You are not alone, church. We've all been there. Some of us are right there with you right now. Let's just be honest about it, right? For a whole lot of different reasons, most of which we talked about in the very beginning here. Some of us are working through some doubt about something in our lives right now. And those of us who've overcome some doubt in our lives, I'll bet you some of us are going to be back there again. Amen? That's the reality. And some of us need to get this morning. If you're having some trouble with doubt this morning, you need to own it. You need to admit it. There's nothing to be ashamed of. There's no reason to hide it from somebody. Admit that you're wrestling with some doubt today, because until you admit it, you will never overcome it. Amen? Until you admit that you've got some doubt in your heart, you will never overcome it. Thomas didn't hesitate to admit it, and it was the first step to an openness to what could be. Now, it's important for us to admit that we wrestle with doubt, but you cannot let doubt keep you from believing in what's possible. Amen? You cannot let doubt keep you from believing in what's possible. I don't know about you, but I love Thomas's response here. Not because it was faithful, but because it was real. Amen? I like real, don't you? Sometimes real is hard, but man, I really appreciate it when people are real with me, right? I would way prefer that to some pretend thing. And that's what Thomas was here. He was real. When the others who had doubted Jesus was showing up, announced to him that Jesus had stopped in to see them, he says, there is no way that I buy that. The only way I'm going to get anywhere close to that is if you bring Jesus to me right here and let me touch him. Let me see him for myself, because there's no way I can buy it otherwise. What do you hear when you hear Thomas in that moment? You know what I hear? I hear somebody who wants to believe. Amen? I hear somebody who wants to believe. I hear a man who more than anything else wants it to be true that Jesus has just returned. He didn't shut them down. He didn't write off their testimony as the rantings of a raving lunatic. He didn't throw his hands in the air and say, you guys have lost your minds and I'm out of here. He kept the door open for the possibility that maybe Jesus was back. Thomas's response, while usually seen as a bad thing, got me thinking, how often do I just write God off in any given situation that I'm facing? How often do I just not believe that God can or will heal somebody in my life? How often do I just decide that God will or won't do something based on what I've seen him personally do, with no regard for what I know he's done in the past? Amen? How often do I not leave the door open to the possibility that God can do and will do exactly what he says he will do? Amen? If I'm being honest, I'm ashamed to admit that I too often base what I believe about God's ability on my own flawed view and experience. And when I get there, I'm in trouble. Amen? What strikes me about this story is it's not the first time doubt shows up in the Bible. How many of you heard a guy named Abraham? Anybody? You know about Abraham. If there was anybody in the world who had a reason to doubt something that God was telling him, it was Abraham, right? He comes to Abraham one day. God and Abraham doesn't know God at this point. And he shows up to him one day. He says, hey, Abraham, you're going to be the father of many nations. And I can hear Abraham now. God, you know I'm 75, right? I'm 75. That's where Abraham was, right? It sounded like the craziest thing he'd ever heard. How about Moses? The first time that Moses has a God encounter that he recognizes as a God encounter, God says to Moses, listen, I got a job for you to do. I want you to lead the people, my people of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses takes a pause and he looks at God and he says, God, you know I'm a killer, right? You realize I'm a rebel, right? You know they don't like me there. I'm a fugitive from Egypt. You're going to use me? Right? They had some doubt. And by the way, the stories go and go and go. There's story after story about doubt. And it occurred to me that all those stories are there to remind us and to remind Thomas that no matter how dire things look, God can be trusted to do exactly what God says he'll do. Amen? God can be trusted to do exactly what he says he'll do. What happens with Abraham? It seems to take a while, certainly longer than Abraham wanted it to take. But at the end of the day, he has two sons, one of whom was born of Sarah. And what happens? He becomes the father of many nations. Amen? How about Moses? Moses thought this was the craziest thing he'd ever heard, but when he looked up, God was sending plagues and opening up a sea so that the people of Israel could walk across it on dry land. Here's the truth, church. God says something, God does something. Amen? And when he does that, it's a reminder to us that God is going to take care of us in whatever situation we find ourselves in, right? All of these times remind us that whatever it is that you doubt this morning, every time God makes a promise, God keeps a promise. Every single time. When he says he's going to do something, he does it. So let me ask you, what are you doubting this morning? Are you doubting that God cares about what you're going through? The book of James says that we should cast our cares upon him. You know why? Because he cares deeply about you. Right? Are you afraid that God's not going to be there when the going gets tough? Over and over again, God tells his people, don't be afraid, for I'm with you. And then he shows up right before the boat's about to turn over, right? Over and over again, are you afraid that you aren't loved, that you can't be loved because you are who you are and you've done what you've done? If that's you, listen to these words from Paul. He says, nothing, neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither fears for today or our worries about tomorrow, not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's great love. Amen? Because all of that is true, when you face some doubt, never shut the door to the possibility that God's going to do exactly what God says he's going to do. Amen? Doubt wins in your life when you stop believing that everything is possible with God. That's when doubt wins. Never forget what God has already done so that you don't forget that what God can absolutely do in your life. Now here's what that means. What it means is that you need to act on faith and not on your doubt. You need to act on faith and not on your doubt. How many of you remember a couple of weeks ago we were talking about being Easter people? You remember the phrase Easter people? Anybody? What do we say Easter people do? Do you remember? No, that's not what we said about Easter people. We said that Easter people walk by what? Faith and not by sight, right? They walk by faith and not by sight. They walk believing in what God has done rather than in what they see in front of them every single moment of the day. Amen? That's what Easter people do. Thomas and the others didn't believe that Jesus came back until he saw it with his own eyes. And Jesus loved them through it. But look at what he says to Thomas and the others after their encounter. He said, blessed are those who believe without seeing me. Guess what that means for us, church? What that means for us is that those of us who haven't had the benefit of seeing Jesus' nail-scarred hands, those of us who haven't had a physical encounter with the living Jesus are blessed if we trust him anyway. Amen? Walking by faith and not by sight. It's easy to act on our doubt. It's easy to do nothing and to throw up our hands and to give up because we just don't believe that God's going to come through. It's easy to try and do everything to fix it ourselves because we don't think God is going to do what God said he would do. But that's not what Easter people do. Amen? When encounter with doubt, that's not what Easter people do. We don't let doubt rule in our lives. We don't let doubt rule because we act on what we believe is possible. Faith, not sight, church. What God does, what God has done, not on what it looks like is going to happen based only on what I can see in front of me. Right? God has calmed the storm before. He can calm the storm again. Amen? God has healed before. Why can't he heal today? The answer is he can. Right? God has set captives free before. He will not leave me in bondage if I'm seeking to be set free. God never changes. He's always faithful to complete what he starts. He always does what he says he's going to do, and because that's true, he can be trusted. Amen? He can be trusted. There's a great story in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 9 where this guy comes to Jesus looking for help. And his son is possessed by a demon, and he's asking Jesus to deliver him. And quite frankly, the guy he actually believes that there's really nothing that can help, but he comes to Jesus in sort of a last-ditch effort, right? And he comes to Jesus, and it's clear from the moment that you see the encounter that he doubts that it's going to happen, but he comes anyway. Notice that he comes anyway. And I love what Jesus says to him as he takes a step out in the little bit of faith that he has. He says, everything is possible for those who believe. Everything is possible. And listen to how the man responds. He says, Jesus, I believe. Help my unbelief. Jesus, I believe. Help my unbelief. In other words, Jesus, I want to believe. I'm trying to believe. I'm trying to get there. I'm giving this everything I got. Get me to where I need to be. Now, if you've paid attention in the past or if you've read that story before, you know how this story ends, church, right? This little boy gets healed. Amen? The little boy gets healed. Jesus' little boy, or this young man, is set free by Jesus. And the man acts on the little bit of faith he has rather than letting his doubt cripple him. And it sets him free. And church, that's what we're supposed to do, right? Act on your faith and not on your doubt. Now, there's one more piece of advice I want to give you. When you are struggling with doubt, surround yourself with people of faith. I want you to turn to your right and say thank you. I want you to turn to your left and I want you to say thank you. You are sitting in a room today filled with people of faith, and it's those kind of people that you need to surround yourself with when you find yourself in a moment of doubt. Amen? Now, what I've learned about people who struggle with doubt, who are struggling with a moment of anger toward God or of disbelief toward God, is that what we tend to do is we do the opposite of what we should do. We either isolate, get off by ourselves, or we surround ourselves with people who are angry just like we are. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Isn't that what we do? Yeah, it's exactly what we do. But here's the reality. It's easier to do that, but it's also the most crippling thing you can do when you're trying to overcome your doubt. When you're struggling with doubt, you need people of faith in your life. People who trust that God can do and will do what God says he's going to do. People who remind you of God's faithfulness no matter what. People who are praying for you. People who are ready to encourage you. Notice what Thomas does here. The guys who had already reconnected with Jesus tell him the news. Thomas could have gone running. Many of us would have. But look what he does instead. 8 days later, when Jesus returns, where's Thomas? Thomas is with the guys, right? Those guys who he thought had lost their minds, he's still with them. Because he's holding on to hope. Maybe there's something to what they've said, right? But he stays right where he is. He was with those guys who already knew that Jesus was alive. He was hanging with people of faith, even though he couldn't get there himself. Church, that's a good word for us, amen? In our darkest times, in those moments when we're overwhelmed with doubt, we need to do what seems counterintuitive. We need to surround ourselves with people who know what we don't know yet, amen? We need to be with people who believe what we can't quite wrap our brains around. I have a pastor friend who lives in Chicago, and he was telling me the story of a parishioner who came up to him about a year ago, and she was struggling with doubt, and his response to her, it was right after church, and I don't know if you know this about pastor, but like he doesn't remember anything you say to him like within 10 minutes of worship, right? So if you come up to me and you ask me to remember something, you can just know for sure it won't happen. Amen? So in that kind of manner, she comes up and she says, Pastor, I'm struggling with doubt, and he says to her, I love this, he says, well, you can borrow some of my faith. And then he laid a hand on her shoulder and he prayed for her and she walked out, and it was like he never had that conversation, right? A month later, the woman comes up to pastor after church and says, you know, when you told me to borrow some of your faith, I took that to heart. I saw how much you believe God could do what I couldn't see, and so I leaned on your faith during my toughest times, and it really helped me, right? When you are struggling with doubt, you need to be around people like that. People whose faith you can borrow a little bit of when you're in a tight spot. People who are there to walk with you. Don't isolate. Don't surround yourself with people who are going to convince you that you are right to not trust God. But grab hold of the people who know what God has done and surround yourself with those people. I told you in the beginning about my cousin Tom. Now, I've known Tom my whole life, and I had no idea the struggle that he was facing. And I really couldn't believe how vulnerable he got when he sent me this email in response to that one-sentence Facebook post. I responded later that day. I thanked him for opening up. I told him how sorry I was for what he'd been through. And then I made the commitment to pray for him. And I did. I prayed for him. A week later, unprompted by me, and I felt like that was sort of my bad. But unprompted by me, Tom sends me a note that I wanted to share with you. He says, God has been shedding some light on that dark place in my life and breathed new life into me. I haven't struggled with pornography since I opened up to you a week ago, and that light inspires me to seek out a counselor to work through some of the stuff in my past. But the best part of all of this is that for the first time in years, I'm starting to believe that the freedom from pain and depression and loneliness that I've been stuck in for 30 years is possible. I'm starting to believe that maybe there's a God who cares. I'm starting to believe that maybe there's a God who can do something about it, and it's breathing new life into me. Now, church, I'm not saying that it always happens quite that fast, right? But isn't that awesome? That God can reveal himself to you just that quickly if that's what needs to happen. In that moment, that's exactly what Tom needed. Guys, we all struggle with doubt. Every single one of us. But you don't need to let doubt define who you are. You better not, as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, you better not let doubt be the final word in your life. Amen? When you let your doubt come into the light, when you believe that healing and wholeness and freedom are a possibility, even if you can't see it right now, when you act on your faith and not on your doubt, when you surround yourself with people who are ready to walk this journey with you and to encourage you about how God can walk you right through it, you'll start to see life in a brand new way. Amen? And you'll start to overcome the doubt that you're facing, and you'll find new life. I asked you in the beginning to think about what it is that's causing you to doubt today. What is it in your life right now that's leading you to say, you know what, I don't know if God cares? What is it in your life today that's got you going, I don't know if God could do anything about this? What is it in your life today that's got you thinking, I'm not even sure there is a God? I want you to close your eyes right now, and I want you to think about what that could be. What is that thing right now that has you doubting that God is or that God can? I want you to begin healing today. And I think we begin healing when we admit and own up to the fact that we're struggling with some doubt. That we come clean about it. And so I just want to invite you right now, take a moment and tell God what it is that you're struggling with.